Hey friends, tonight we're stepping away from the buzz of modern life and wandering into the deep, frozen past, way before empires, before kings, before even the idea of history. We're going somewhere colder, wilder, quieter. This new series takes us to Ice Age Europe, home to snow-covered valleys, woolly mammoths, and a group of humans who lived here long before us, the Neanderthals. Now, maybe you've heard of them, probably not in the most flattering way, but they weren't just brutish cave dwellers. These people were survivors, fire makers, tool builders, child raisers. They lived through glaciers, hunted giant beasts, and maybe, just maybe, dreamed under the same stars we still see today. So if you've ever wondered what life was like before roads, before writing, before warm socks, you're in the right place. This series is about the slow, silent, nearly forgotten rhythms of survival. It's about the old world, the real old world, where staying alive meant building a fire, sharing a mammoth bone, and hoping spring would come back. But before we begin, get cozy. Turn off the bright lights, maybe cue up a soft crackling fire sound or a light wind if that helps you drift. This is your time to unwind. If you're new here, welcome. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into the forgotten corners of history, feel free to follow along. No pressure. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing sleepy folks from every time zone slowly fading into dreamland together. So take a deep breath. The world can wait. Let's step into the Ice Age. Together.
The first footprints when Neanderthals appeared in Europe. Before the first word was written, before the first king was crowned, before the idea of history itself had a name, Europe was a different world. It was a continent of deep, silent forests, of rivers that ran wild and unnamed, and of mountains that had never been measured. It was a world waiting, a stage being set. And onto this stage, moving with a quiet purpose that we can now only glimpse through the mists of time, walked a new kind of human. They were not our direct ancestors, but our cousins, a sister branch on the great tangled tree of life. We call them Neanderthals. Their story does not begin with a sudden arrival, but with a slow, generational unfolding, a gradual becoming. Their first footprints were not made in a single moment, but over tens of thousands of years, as their predecessors, a group known as Homo heidelbergensis, slowly adapted to the cooling climates of the Middle Pleistocene. Imagine a time some 400,000 years ago. The air is colder than what we know. Great sheets of ice, miles thick, periodically grind their way south, sculpting the very bones of the land, and then retreat, leaving behind a changed world. In the forests and grasslands that bloom in the warmer interglacial periods, these early proto-Neanderthals lived. We find their faint traces in the earth: a stone tool, a fire-cracked rock, a fossilized bone. In a place called the Cima de los Huesos in Spain, the Pit of Bones, archaeologists descended into a deep cavern to find the remains of at least 28 individuals. They were not yet fully Neanderthal, but the distinctive features were beginning to emerge: the strong brow ridge, the long and low skull, the powerful, stocky build. It was as if Europe itself was shaping them, molding their bodies to endure the coming cold. They were a people of the twilight, emerging from one form of humanity and evolving into another. Their spread across Europe was not a conquest or a grand migration. It was a slow, organic expansion, likely following the great herds of herbivores that they were lifeblood. A family group might move into a new valley, finding a promising rock shelter, a reliable spring, and good hunting grounds. They would live there, perhaps for a season, perhaps for a lifetime. Their children and their children's children might then move into the next valley and the next. Over countless generations, this quiet, almost imperceptible drift carried them from the shores of the Mediterranean to the wind-swept plains of what is now northern Germany, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the foothills of the Ural Mountains. They became the first true Europeans, their bodies and minds exquisitely tuned to a continent of dramatic and often brutal climatic shifts. They were not intruders in this world. They were its native children, born of its earth and its ice. Their story is not one of kings and empires, but of resilience, of adaptation, and of a deep, abiding connection to a land that has long since vanished. These first footprints, faint and ancient as they are, mark the beginning of a dominion that would last for over 300,000 years, a silent epic written in stone and bone.
The ice draws closer. Life in the freezing shadows of the Pleistocene. The world of the Neanderthals was a world governed by ice. We call this epoch the Pleistocene, but for those who lived it, it was simply the world as it was, a place of profound and cyclical change. For thousands of years at a time, the great glaciers would advance from the north, colossal rivers of frozen water that scraped the land bare and locked much of the world's moisture into their crystalline hearts. Sea levels fell, exposing vast coastal plains. The climate of Europe grew colder, drier, and more severe. The lush, temperate forests retreated to southern refuges, replaced by a stark and beautiful landscape, the Mammoth Steppe. This was a vast, cold and semi-arid grassland, stretching from Spain to Siberia, an ecosystem that has no perfect modern equivalent. It was a world of immense open skies and horizons that seemed to stretch on forever, carpeted not with lush grass, but with hardy sedges, herbs, and dwarf willows. To survive here was to be a master of this unforgiving environment, and it was here that the Neanderthals thrived. They were not merely enduring the cold, they were born of it, their bodies a testament to natural selection's power. Their short, stocky build, with wide chests and short limbs, was a biological advantage, conserving heat far more efficiently than the taller, leaner bodies of their African cousins. Their large, wide noses may have served as a remarkable adaptation, a built-in radiator to warm and humidify the frigid, dry air with each breath before it reached their lungs. They moved through this landscape not as frightened survivors, but as the apex predators, the undisputed masters of their domain. They shared this world with an astonishing cast of giant creatures, the megafauna of the Ice Age. Imagine standing on a ridge, the wind cold on your face, looking out over the steppe. In the distance, a herd of woolly mammoths moves like a slow, lumbering mountain range, their great curved tusks sweeping through the low vegetation. A woolly rhinoceros, a solitary and ill-tempered beast, snorts in a thicket of dwarf birch. Herds of giant deer, with antlers spanning 12 feet, graze on the open plains alongside wild horses and immense bison. In the caves and forests lurked predators of immense power. The cave lion, larger than any modern lion, and the great cave bear, a creature that could tower over a man. This was the world the Neanderthals navigated every day. It was a world of constant vigilance, of profound respect for the power of nature, and of an intimate, hard-won knowledge of the animals they hunted and lived alongside. They knew the migratory routes of the reindeer, the birthing grounds of the bison, the places where the mammoths came to drink. Their lives were woven into the very fabric of this ecosystem, a rhythm of hunt and rest, of feast and famine, dictated by the seasons and the slow, inexorable pulse of the ice. The freezing shadows were not just a backdrop to their lives, they were the crucible in which their culture, their biology, and their spirit were forged.
Narrative-ready story. Tools of the Quiet Hunters.
what stone scrapers and spears reveal about their minds. To understand the Neanderthal mind, we must look to their hands. For hundreds of thousands of years, they left behind an extraordinary legacy, not of art or writing, but of stone tools. These were not the crude, haphazard choppers of earlier hominins. They were the products of a sophisticated and standardized technology, a tradition we call the Mousterian industry. To hold a Neanderthal tool is to hold a thought frozen in stone. It is to see evidence of planning, of foresight, of a complex sequence of actions carried out to achieve a specific, preconceived goal. It is, in its own silent way, a conversation with a mind from a lost world. The foundation of their technology was a technique of breathtaking ingenuity, known as the Levallois method. A napper would not simply strike a rock to get a sharp flake. Instead, they would meticulously prepare a core of flint or other suitable stone, shaping its sides and top in a precise sequence. It was like sculpting a turtle shell. With the core perfectly prepared, a single decisive blow to a prepared platform at one end would detach a flake of a predetermined size and shape. The result was a perfect, ready-to-use tool, sharp and efficient, produced with minimal waste. This process reveals so much. It shows an ability to think in the abstract, to see the final tool hidden within the raw block of stone. It requires a deep understanding of the properties of the material, a mental template, and a steady, practiced hand. This was not instinct. This was taught, learned, and passed down through generations. From these prepared cores, they created a veritable toolkit. There were sharp points, which were hafted onto wooden shafts to create deadly, heavy-duty spears. These were not throwing spears, but powerful thrusting weapons designed for close-quarters encounters with large, dangerous prey. There were side scrapers of various designs, their curved edges perfect for the laborious task of scraping fat and tissue from animal hides, the first step in creating warm clothing, blankets, or shelter coverings. There were denticulates, tools with serrated, tooth-like edges which acted as saws for working wood, bone, or antler. Each tool was a solution to a problem, a physical manifestation of their intelligence. They were pragmatists, creating what was needed for the task at hand. The specific types of tools we find vary from site to site, suggesting they adapted their toolkit to the local resources and the specific animals they were hunting. In one place, we might find more spear points, in another, more hide scrapers. This is not the work of mindless brutes. This is the signature of a flexible, adaptable, and highly intelligent people. Their world was silent in our terms, lacking the clatter of our technology, but it was filled with the sharp, percussive sound of stone striking stone, the sound of the Neanderthal mind at work. A language without words. How Neanderthals may have communicated. The air in a Neanderthal camp would have been thick with sounds, the crackle of the fire, the scraping of a stone tool against a hide, the cry of a distant bird. But what of their voices? Did they speak? For decades, this question was answered with a firm no, another piece of the brutish caricature. A being that was not fully human, it was argued, could not possess the gift of language. Yet as the evidence has accumulated, a different picture has emerged, one of a people who almost certainly communicated in a way that was complex, nuanced, and vital to their survival. The question is not if they communicated, but how. The first line of evidence comes from their very bones. In Khabara, Israel, archaeologists found a Neanderthal skeleton that included a small U-shaped bone called the hyoid. In modern humans, the hyoid bone is critical for speech as it anchors the muscles of the tongue and larynx. The Neanderthal hyoid bone was virtually identical to our own. This anatomical evidence suggests that they had the physical capacity for a wide range of vocalizations. Furthermore, reconstructions of their inner ear canals show they were tuned to the same frequency range as our own, the range most sensitive to the sounds of human speech. Genetically, we now know they possessed the same FOXP2 gene that is so strongly linked to language and speech control in modern humans. The physical hardware, it seems, was in place. But language is more than just anatomy. It is a product of social and cognitive complexity. And here, the indirect evidence is overwhelming. Consider their hunting practices. To cooperatively bring down a giant bison or a herd of wild horses with thrusting spears requires immense coordination. It demands a shared plan, the ability to signal intent, to warn of danger, to direct the actions of others in real time. It is almost impossible to imagine such a feat being accomplished with simple grunts and gestures alone. Consider their tool-making. The Levallois technique, with its complex, multi-stage process, was a skill that had to be taught. A master namper would have needed to demonstrate and explain the process to a novice, correcting mistakes, guiding the learner's hand. This transmission of complex knowledge, generation after generation, for over 200,000 years, strongly implies a sophisticated communication system. Their language may not have sounded like ours. Their different vocal tract shape might have produced a different range of sounds, perhaps higher pitched or more nasal. It may have lacked the complex recursive syntax that allows us to embed clauses within clauses. Perhaps it was a language more focused on the here and now, on the practicalities of survival, the landscape, the animals, the social bonds within the clan. It might have been interwoven with a rich vocabulary of gestures, postures, and facial expressions, a multimodal system of communication. But to sit around a fire, to share food, to care for the sick and injured, to mourn the dead, to navigate a vast and dangerous world together, these are the acts of a people bound by a shared understanding. In the silence of the archaeological record, we can almost hear the echoes of their voices, a quiet instruction, a warning call, a mother's comforting murmur, a story told in the flickering firelight. It was a language without words we can ever recover, but its existence is written in everything they did.
Fire in the cave, the ritual and survival of controlling flame. In the deep, abiding cold of the Ice Age, one discovery, one skill, was more than just an advantage. It was the very heart of survival. It was the mastery of fire. For Neanderthals, fire was not merely a chemical reaction. It was a living presence at the center of their world. It was warmth against the biting cold, a shield against the endless night, and a transformative power that turned the raw and dangerous into the cooked and nourishing. A Neanderthal hearth, a simple ring of stones or a depression in the cave floor, was the focal point of their existence, a beacon of light and life in a world of shadow and ice. The archaeological evidence for their control of fire is unambiguous and widespread. At sites across Europe and the Near East, we find ancient hearths, layered one on top of another, indicating continuous use over many generations. These are not the remnants of natural wildfires. They are contained, deliberate structures, filled with charcoal, fire-cracked rocks, and the charred bones of their meals. Analysis of these remains shows they were sophisticated fire users. They selected specific types of wood for fuel, likely understanding which ones burned hotter or longer. They may have used fire to harden the tips of their wooden spears, turning a simple sharpened stick into a formidable weapon. The presence of birch bark tar, an ancient superglue used to haft stone points to their spears, is another testament to their pyrotechnology. This tar can only be produced by heating birch bark in an oxygen-deprived environment,
a process requiring a level of control and understanding that is truly remarkable. But the importance of fire went far beyond its practical applications. It was a social anchor. As darkness fell across the Mammoth Steppe and the great predators of the night began to stir, the cave entrance would have been a place of vulnerability. But inside, in the flickering orange glow of the hearth, there was safety. The fire kept the cave lions and hyenas at bay, its light a protective circle against the immense, pressing dark. Around this fire, the clan would gather. Here they would share the day's hunt, the meat cooked over the flames, making it not only safer to eat, but also unlocking more of its precious calories and nutrients. This simple act of cooking may have been a crucial factor in supporting their large, energy-demanding brains and bodies. Imagine this scene. The elders sit close to the warmth, their faces lined with the knowledge of countless seasons. The hunters mend their tools and weapons, their hands deft and practiced in the dancing light. The children, safe within the circle of their family, listen to the sounds of the adults, their eyes wide with the wonder and fear of their world. This was the first living room, the first community center. It was here that knowledge was passed down, where social bonds were forged, where the group reinforced its identity. The fire was a constant companion, a presence that was both tamed and wild. It was a piece of the sun, brought down to earth and sheltered in the cave. To control fire was to hold a measure of power over the harshness of their world, a daily ritual of survival that was also, in its own way, a celebration of their humanity. Faces in the dark. What they looked like and why it matters. For so long, the face of the Neanderthal was a mask, a caricature drawn by prejudice and incomplete science. It was the face of the brutish, unintelligent other, a convenient foil to our own triumphant story. But as we have uncovered more complete skeletons and developed new ways of reading the story written in their bones and in their genes, a new face has emerged from the darkness of the past. It is a face that is different from our own, yes, but it is undeniably profoundly human. To look upon this reconstructed face is to look into the eyes of a lost branch of our own family, and to understand them, we must first see them clearly. Let us build this face, piece by piece, from the evidence they left behind. The skull was long and low, not domed like ours, with a distinctive bulge at the back known as an occipital bun. The forehead was sloping, and above the eyes ran a prominent double-arched brow ridge. This was not the heavy, straight bar of a gorilla, but a more elegant, curved structure. For a long time, its purpose was a mystery, but it may have simply been a result of the skull's overall architecture, a structural buttress for their powerful jaws. Their midface projected forward, pulling the nose and teeth away from the brain case. This created a unique and striking profile, one dominated by a large, wide nose. This nose, far from being a primitive feature, was likely a sophisticated adaptation to the cold, dry air of Ice Age Europe, its large internal volume serving to warm and humidify each breath. Their jaws were strong and lacked the prominent chin that is a hallmark of Homo sapiens. Their teeth were large and often show extreme wear, not just from a tough diet, but from being used as a third hand for gripping hides, sinew, and wood while they worked. Their bodies were a match for their powerful heads. They were shorter than us, on average with men standing around 5.5 feet tall, but they were immensely powerful. Their bones were thicker and more robust than ours, with markings that show where massive muscles once attached. Their chests were broad and barrel-shaped, their limbs relatively short. This was the physique of a people built for power, endurance, and, crucially, for the cold. A compact, heat-conserving frame. What of the features that bone cannot tell us? For this, we turn to genetics. The sequencing of the Neanderthal genome has revealed tantalizing clues. We know that at least some Neanderthals carry genes for red hair and pale skin. This makes perfect sense in the low light conditions of northern latitudes, where pale skin is more efficient in producing vital vitamin D. It shatters the old image of dark, ape-like creatures, replacing it with a plausible vision of a people with a range of hair and skin tones, perhaps not unlike modern Europeans. Why does this matter? Because seeing them accurately, as powerful, well-adapted people with fair skin and perhaps even freckles, forces us to confront our own biases. It makes them familiar. It collapses the distance we have created between us and them. The face in the dark is not the face of a monster or a failed experiment. It is the face of another kind of human, a successful and resilient people who mastered a continent for 1,000 generations. It is a face that deserves our respect and our recognition.
The Hunter's Code, tracking prey through snow and forest. The Neanderthal world was a world of meat. While they certainly ate plants, nuts, and tubers when available, the chemical signatures locked in their bones tell an unambiguous story. They were top-level carnivores, apex predators who dined regularly on the largest and most dangerous animals of the Ice Age. To be a Neanderthal hunter was not to be an opportunistic scavenger, picking at the leftovers of other predators. It was to be a master of a deadly craft, a repository of immense ecological knowledge, and a participant in a high-stakes, cooperative enterprise that demanded courage, strength, and a profound understanding of the animal world. Their primary weapon was the heavy wooden spear, tipped with a masterfully crafted stone point. These were not light, aerodynamic javelins for throwing from a safe distance. The physics of these spears, combined with the patterns of injury found on Neanderthal skeletons, points to a terrifyingly dangerous hunting strategy: close quarters combat. A Neanderthal hunt was not a chase across the open plain. It was an ambush, an organized, violent confrontation. They were masters of the landscape, using gullies, cliffs, and thickets to their advantage, driving their prey into kill sites where the animals were at a disadvantage. Imagine a group of hunters moving with practiced silence through a stand of pine. They have been tracking a herd of giant bison for days, reading the signs in the earth: a broken twig, a fresh dropping, the depth of a hoofprint in the mud. They know this valley. They know the choke point up ahead where a rock slide has narrowed the game trail. The plan is set in whispered tones and hand signals. Some of the group move ahead, creating a barrier, while others circle around to drive the herd forward. The air grows tense. The smell of the animals is strong on the wind. Then, with a sudden series of calls, the trap is sprung. The bison panic, stampeding down the trail directly into the waiting spears. The next few moments are a chaotic explosion of muscle, fear, and adrenaline. The hunters must be precise, fearless. They surge forward, not throwing their spears, but thrusting them deep into the vital organs of a chosen animal, using the weight of their powerful bodies to drive the point home. It is a brutal, intimate work. A wounded bison is an engine of destruction, and a single mistake could mean being gored, trampled, or crushed. This is why so many Neanderthal skeletons show healed fractures on their heads, arms, and ribs, injuries remarkably similar to those of modern rodeo riders. They were taking on half-ton beasts at point-blank range. But the hunt was more than just the kill. It was the knowledge that preceded it. They understood the seasonal migrations of reindeer, the calving seasons of horses, the habits of the solitary woolly rhino. They would have studied their prey with the intensity of a modern biologist, learning their behaviors, their weaknesses, their very nature. This knowledge was their most important tool, a code passed down through generations, a mental map of their world and its living resources. To succeed, they had to think like their prey, to anticipate its movements, to become part of the landscape. The hunter's code was one of brutal intimacy, of deep knowledge, and of a courage that is difficult for us in our safe and distant world to fully comprehend. Children of the Mammoth Age. What life was like for a Neanderthal child. In the story of the Neanderthals, a story so often dominated by mighty hunters and harsh survival, it is easy to forget the smallest members of the clan. But they were there, in the firelight of the cave, their lives the mixture of immense peril
and, we must believe, profound care. To be a Neanderthal child was to be born into a world of giants. Giant bears, giant lions, giant mammoths, and giant challenges. The archaeological record gives us only faint, poignant glimpses into their world. But from these whispers, we can begin to reconstruct a life. Life began with a high degree of risk. Infant and child mortality was likely very high, a brutal reality of life before modern medicine and in such a demanding environment. A difficult birth, a sudden illness, a moment of inattention near the fire or the cave mouth, any of these could be fatal. The small size of Neanderthal groups, perhaps only 15 to 30 individuals, meant that every child who survived was precious, the key to the future of the clan. The discovery of Neanderthal children deliberately buried, such as the 2-year-old found at Dederia Cave in Syria, laid carefully in a pit with a flint tool placed on its chest, suggests a deep emotional investment and a sense of loss that we can recognize across the millennia. A child's world would have been the area around the hearth, the home base. Their earliest memories would have been the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat, the feel of animal hides, and the low murmur of their families' voices. Their education was not formal, but immersive. They learned by watching, listening, and doing. A young child would watch their mother or another relative scrape a hide, their eyes following the rhythmic movement of the stone tool. They would see the hunters return, sometimes victorious and laden with meat, other times empty-handed and injured. They would learn the faces of their small kin group, understanding the complex web of relationships that held their world together. Play was likely a form of practice. A game of tag would build agility. Throwing stones at a target would build aim. Mimicking the adults would instill the patterns of daily life. As they grew, their world would expand. They would venture out from the cave with the adults on gathering trips, learning to identify edible plants, nuts, and berries. They would learn which mushrooms were safe and which were poison, where to find birds' eggs, and how to catch small game. They would learn the names and natures of the great beasts, not from books, but from direct and sometimes dangerous observation. The boys especially would have watched the men with intense focus, learning how to read tracks, how to flake stone, and how to handle a spear. The evidence from their teeth, which grow in layers like tree rings, shows that Neanderthal children matured faster than we do, likely reaching a physical adolescence several years earlier. This was a life on an accelerated timetable, a necessity in a world where the window for learning the essential skills of survival was short. To be a child of the Mammoth Age was to grow up fast, to learn the hard lessons of the world early, and to carry the future of your people in your small hands.
The shared hearth, family, shelter, and the meaning of home. What is a home? Is it a structure of wood and stone, or is it something less tangible? A place of safety, of belonging, of shared identity. For the Neanderthals, who left no cities or monuments, home was both a physical place and a social reality. It was the rock shelter or cave that offered protection from the elements, and it was the small, tightly knit group of kin who shared its space. The center of this home, its literal and symbolic heart, was the hearth. Around this shared fire, the complex dynamics of Neanderthal family life played out for 1,000 generations. The classic image is of the caveman, and while Neanderthals did make extensive use of caves and rock shelters, this was a matter of practicality, not a lack of imagination. A cave is a ready-made fortress. It is cool in the summer, relatively warm in the winter, and offers a defensible position against the great predators of the Ice Age. Archaeological excavations of these sites reveal a surprising degree of organization. We find distinct areas for different activities. The entrance might be a butchering zone, littered with the bones of hunted animals. Deeper inside, near the hearth, would be the primary living space, a napping floor where tools were made, leaving behind a carpet of tiny flint chips, and a sleeping area, likely lined with soft animal hides and grasses for comfort and warmth. Some sites, like Brunicle Cave in France, show constructions deep within the cave system, rings of deliberately broken stalagmites built long before modern humans arrived in Europe. The purpose is a mystery, but it speaks to a mastery of the underground world and a desire to shape their environment. The family that lived in this home was likely a small, extended family group. Genetic evidence from a group of Neanderthals found in a Siberian cave suggests they lived in patrilocal societies, where females would leave their birth group to join the group of their mate. This flow of females between groups would have been essential for maintaining genetic diversity in their small, scattered populations. Life within the group was one of intense interdependence. Survival was a collective project. The hunters who brought down a bison could not have done so alone, and the fruits of their dangerous work were shared among the entire clan. The individuals who stayed behind, tending the fire, caring for the young, processing hides, and gathering plants, were just as crucial to the group's success. This interdependence created powerful social bonds, a sense of mutual obligation that is one of their most human traits. We see this most clearly in the way they cared for the vulnerable. Skeletons of elderly Neanderthals or those with severe injuries and disabilities show that they were kept alive and cared for long after they would have been able to fend for themselves. The old man of Shanadar in Iraq lived for years with a crushed eye socket that would have left him partially blind, a withered arm, and severe arthritis. He could not have hunted or even kept up with the group on his own. His survival is a silent testament to the compassion and social responsibility of his kin. For Neanderthals, home was not just a place to sleep. It was a functioning cooperative unit, a web of relationships and mutual support. It was the safe harbor in the storm of the Pleistocene, a place defined not by its walls, but by the shared warmth of the hearth. The Winter of 1,000 Nights. How they endured the Ice Age's cruelest seasons. The Pleistocene was a time of cycles, of glacial advances and retreats, but even in the warmer interglacial periods, a European winter was a thing of profound severity. For the Neanderthals, winter was not just a season, it was the ultimate test of their skill, their resilience, and their foresight. As the days grew shorter and a deep, biting cold settled over the land, the vibrant mammoth steppe would transform into a desolate world of wind, snow, and ice. The herds of herbivores would migrate to more sheltered valleys or to the south, and the plants that provided a small but important part of their diet would wither and die. For months on end, the world offered little, and survival depended entirely on what had been prepared and on the sheer endurance of the people. Their bodies were their first line of defense. The stocky, powerful build, the large nose, the entire Neanderthal physique was a furnace built to burn calories and conserve heat against the relentless cold. But biology alone was not enough. Survival depended on technology and behavior. The most critical piece of technology was clothing. The numerous stone scrapers found at every Neanderthal site are the silent evidence of a constant, laborious task, the preparation of animal hides. A freshly skinned hide is stiff and will rot. To make it into pliable, insulating leather requires scraping away all the fat and tissue, then treating it, perhaps by smoking it or rubbing it with animal brains and fats. The result was a material that could be fashioned into warm cloaks, leggings, and boots. They did not have fine needles to sew fitted garments like their Homo sapiens successors, but by punching holes with a stone awl and lacing the hides together with sinew, they could create effective multi-layered clothing that trapped body heat and kept out the wind and snow. Shelter was the next crucial element. Caves and rock shelters with their stable temperatures were prime real estate in the winter. A well-tended fire burning near the mouth would create a pocket of warmth and safety, a refuge from the howling gales outside. In areas without natural caves, they may have constructed simple shelters from mammoth bones, branches, and animal hides anchored against the wind. The challenge of finding food was immense. Large game animals were still present, but they were harder to find and harder to hunt in the snow. Neanderthals would have had to rely on their deep knowledge of the landscape to track animals in these difficult conditions. A successful winter hunt would have been a cause for immense relief, providing a life-saving infusion of fresh meat and fat. It is also possible they practiced some form of food storage, perhaps freezing meat in the permafrost or caching it in cold crevices, a prehistoric freezer. The psychological toll of the winter must have been immense. The endless nights, the confinement to the shelter, the constant gnawing cold, the ever-present risk of starvation. This was a time for drawing together, for reinforcing social bonds. It would have been a time for stories, for mending tools, for teaching the young, for keeping the fragile flame of the community alive in the face of the overwhelming dark. Enduring the winter was the ultimate expression of Neanderthal competence. It required a synthesis of their biological adaptations, their technological ingenuity, their social cooperation, and their sheer, stubborn will to live. Each spring was a victory, a testament to their mastery of one of the harshest climates the Earth has ever known.
Narrative-ready story. The Other Humans, when Homo sapiens entered Neanderthal Europe. For over 300,000 years, the Neanderthals were the sole human occupants of Europe. They were the masters of their world, a world of ice and mammoth, forest and steppe. Their reign was long, stable, and successful. But then, sometime around 45,000 years ago, from the southeast, a new kind of human began to filter into the continent. They were taller, leaner, and carried with them a new kind of toolkit and a different way of seeing the world. They were our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens. Their arrival marked the beginning of a unique and fateful chapter in human history, a period of several thousand years when two intelligent, capable, and distinct human species shared the same landscape. The arrival of modern humans was not an invasion, not a blitzkrieg of conquest. It was a slow, piecemeal process, likely following the river valleys like the Danube into the heart of Europe. The continent was sparsely populated, and the initial encounters between the two groups may have been rare and fleeting. Imagine a Neanderthal hunting party cresting a ridge and seeing in the valley below a plume of smoke from an unfamiliar camp. They watch from a distance, their curiosity mixed with caution. They see people who look different, taller, with flatter faces and high domed foreheads. They see them using different tools, perhaps light thrown spears or intricately carved bone points. What did they think? Did they see them as rivals for the same scarce resources? Did they see them as strange but harmless fellow hunters? Or did they see them simply as another part of the complex tapestry of their world? The Homo sapiens who entered Europe, often called Cro-Magnons, were different in several key ways. Their technology, known as the Oranakian, was characterized by long, slender blades struck from a core and a heavy reliance on tools made from bone, antler, and ivory. They carved elaborate spear throwers, or atlatls, which allowed them to hurl their spears with greater force and from a safer distance. They created fine bone needles, which allowed them to sew tightly fitted clothing, a significant advantage in the cold. And most famously, they brought with them a stunning capacity for symbolic expression. They painted magnificent animals on cave walls, carved voluptuous female figurines, and adorned themselves with necklaces of shells and animal teeth. For several millennia, the two populations coexisted. The archaeological record shows a complex picture. In some areas, Neanderthal Mousterian tools are found, and then they are replaced by Oranakian tools, suggesting the newcomers moved in after the Neanderthals had left. In other places, we find a curious hybrid industry, the Chattelperronian, where Neanderthals seem to have adopted some of the techniques of the newcomers, creating their own blade tools and simple personal ornaments. This suggests that the interactions were not always hostile. There was at the very least a transfer of ideas. For a time, Europe was a mosaic of cultures. A Neanderthal clan might occupy one valley, while a Cro-Magnon group occupied the next. They would have hunted the same game, sought shelter in the same caves, and watched the same stars wheel across the immense dark sky. It was a moment of unprecedented human diversity, a world with more than one way of being human. But it was a moment that could not last. The arrival of the other humans marked the beginning of the end for the long reign of the Neanderthals. The bloodline blends, what DNA tells us about interbreeding and legacy. For decades, the question of what happened when Neanderthals and modern humans met was a matter of fierce debate, based on the silent, ambiguous evidence of stones and bones. Did we wipe them out? Did we outcompete them? Or did something else, something more intimate happen? The answer, when it finally came, was not from a new fossil find, but from the microscopic, ghostly world of ancient DNA. It was a discovery that would fundamentally rewrite the story of our own origins and transform the Neanderthals into a dead-end branch of the human family, into a part of our own living heritage. The quest to sequence the Neanderthal genome, led by the Swedish geneticist Svante Pääbo, was a monumental scientific undertaking. It involved drilling tiny amounts of bone powder from precious fossils that were tens of thousands of years old, and then painstakingly piecing together the fragmented, degraded strands of their genetic code. The technical challenges were immense. But in 2010, the first draft of the Neanderthal genome was published, and it held a stunning revelation. When the scientists compared it to the genomes of modern humans from around the world, they found a clear and undeniable signal. Modern humans of non-African descent, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, all of them carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. People of purely African descent, whose ancestors did not participate in the out-of-Africa migration that met the Neanderthals, have none. The conclusion was inescapable. At some point, somewhere, after our Homo sapiens ancestors left Africa, but before they spread out across the rest of the world, they met Neanderthals and had children with them. The primary location for this intermingling was likely the Middle East, a crossroads where both populations existed for thousands of years. But it may have happened in Europe as well. These were not isolated, sterile encounters. They were successful acts of procreation, and the hybrid children were healthy enough to be integrated into the human population and to pass their mixed genetic legacy on to all subsequent generations.
the stark line we had drawn between us and them dissolved. The story was not just simple replacement, but of assimilation and mixture. We did not just wipe them out. In a very real sense, we absorbed them. This discovery changes everything. It means that Neanderthals are not truly extinct. A fragment of their people, their genetic code, lives on, scattered within the cells of billions of modern humans. The bloodline did not end, it blended, flowing into the great river of our own species. This genetic inheritance is not just a silent echo. The Neanderthal genes we carry have functions. Some are linked to our immune system, providing us with defenses against pathogens that our African ancestors had not encountered. Others are related to skin and hair characteristics, perhaps helping our ancestors adapt to the lower light levels outside of the tropics. This ancient encounter, this blending of bloodlines in the distant past, continues to shape our biology today. The story of Neanderthals is no longer just their story. It is our story too.
Burials beneath the earth. The mystery of Neanderthal funerals and spiritual life. In the harsh, pragmatic world of the Neanderthals, where every calorie counted and every action was geared toward survival, what happened when one of the clan died? Was the body simply abandoned, left to the elements and the scavengers? Or was there something more? An act that hints at a deeper, more complex emotional and cognitive world. The evidence, buried in the floors of their caves and shelters, suggests that for Neanderthals, death was not always the end of the story. In numerous sites across their vast range, we find the dead placed carefully in the earth, in what appear to be deliberate burials. These simple ancient acts pose one of the most profound questions in human evolution. Did Neanderthals have a concept of death, of grief, and perhaps even of an afterlife? The evidence for burial is compelling. At sites like La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, the skeleton of the old man was found in a rectangular pit, seemingly dug for the purpose. At Kebara Cave in Israel, a nearly complete skeleton was found lying in a shallow depression, its head apparently removed sometime after burial, a mysterious and intentional act. One of the most famous and evocative sites is Shanidar Cave in Iraq. Here, the remains of 10 different Neanderthals were uncovered. One of them, Shanidar 4, became famous as the flower burial. Soil samples taken from around the skeleton contained large clumps of pollen from several species of brightly colored wildflowers. The archaeologist, Ralph Selecki, proposed a beautiful, romantic vision. The man's clan had gathered wildflowers from the mountainside and laid them on his grave in a final, tender tribute. Today, the flower burial hypothesis is debated. Some scientists argue that the pollen could have been brought into the cave by burrowing rodents. But even without the flowers, the evidence from Shanidar and other sites points to something significant. The bodies are often found in a flexed or fetal position. They are placed in pits or natural depressions and then covered with earth. This is more than simple disposal. Leaving a body on the surface would attract dangerous predators like hyenas to the camp. Burying it is a practical way to prevent this. But is that all it is? The care with which some bodies are positioned, the occasional inclusion of a stone tool or a piece of animal bone as a possible grave good, hints at something more. It hints at ritual. To bury the dead is to perform a liminal act, one that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead. It is an act of remembrance, a final gesture of care for a member of the kin group. It implies that the deceased individual still holds some meaning, some importance, even after life has fled. We cannot know what they were thinking. We cannot know if they believed in spirits, in ghosts,
or in a journey to another world. Their spiritual life is a closed book to us. But the act of burial itself is a behavior that steps beyond the purely practical. It is a sign of attachment, of grief, and of a mind capable of contemplating the profound mystery of death. In these shallow graves, beneath the earthen floors of their ancient homes, we see the first faint glimmers of the kind of symbolic behavior that we have long considered uniquely human. The art that wasn't supposed to exist. Cave marks, symbols, and the birth of expression. For more than a century, the story of art was simple. It began with us, with Homo sapiens. It was our species, with our supposedly superior minds, who first felt the urge to represent the world, to create symbols, to leave a mark that said more than just "I was here." The magnificent painted caves of Lascaux and Chavot were seen as the exclusive province of the Cro-Magnon mind. The Neanderthals, in this narrative, were artless. Their world was one of grim, functional utility, devoid of the symbolic thought that gives rise to beauty and meaning. But this story, like so many others about the Neanderthals, has begun to crumble in the face of new and startling evidence. We are now discovering the faint but persistent traces of a Neanderthal aesthetic, an art that wasn't supposed to exist. The evidence is not as spectacular as the great painted panels of our ancestors, but it is no less significant. It is subtle, suggestive, and powerful in its implications. In several caves in Spain, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales, archaeologists have found simple, abstract art on the walls. There are red lines forming a ladder-like shape, stencils of hands made by blowing pigment over them, and arrangements of dots. The crucial fact about these markings is their age. Using a technique called uranium-thorium dating on the calcite crusts that formed over the paintings, scientists have dated them to more than 64,000 years ago. This is a full 20,000 years before Homo sapiens are known to have arrived in this part of Europe. The only people who could have made them were Neanderthals. This was not a picture of a bison or a horse, it was an abstract symbol, an idea made manifest. It is the beginning of a conversation, a mark of pure intention. The evidence extends beyond cave walls. For over a century, we have known that Neanderthals used pigments, especially red and yellow ochre and black manganese. For a long time, it was assumed this was for purely practical purposes, like tanning hides. But now we find ochre crayons that have been worn down as if used for drawing. We find shells, like those from a cave in southeastern Spain, that are perforated and covered in pigment, suggesting they were worn as beads or pendants. At Kabara Cave in Croatia, a set of egel talons dated to 130,000 years ago show clear signs of being cut, polished, and strung together to be worn as a necklace or other ornament. This is not about function. It is about adornment, about identity, about making a statement. It is a form of symbolic expression, a way of communicating who you are. Even the deep cave structures, like the rings of broken stalagmites in Brunnikel, can be seen in this light. What was their purpose, deep in the absolute darkness, far from any living area? Was it a ritual space? A place for a ceremony we can never comprehend? We don't know. But these findings, taken together, paint a new picture of the Neanderthal mind. It was not a mind confined to the literal and the practical. It was a mind that could think in the abstract, that felt the need to decorate its world and its own body, that could create symbols. It may not have been the same explosion of creativity we see with our own ancestors, but it was there. In these faint red lines, these polished talons, and these pigmented shells, we see the first stirrings of art, the quiet and profound birth of an aesthetic in a world that was for so long thought to be only gray.
The silent music of bones, reconstructing their diet, tools,
and movements. The bones and stones that Neanderthals left behind are more than just inert relics. They are archives, libraries of information waiting to be read by the right scientific techniques. In the last few decades, our ability to decipher the stories locked within these ancient remains has undergone a revolution. We can now listen to the silent music of the bones and from their subtle harmonies reconstruct the lost world of the Neanderthals with astonishing detail. What they ate, how they used their tools, and where they roamed across the vast landscapes of Ice Age Europe. One of the most powerful techniques is stable isotope analysis. The chemical elements in the food an animal eats, including a Neanderthal, are incorporated into its growing bones and teeth. Different types of food sources, such as plants, land animals, or marine animals, have distinct chemical signatures. By analyzing the ratios of isotopes like carbon and nitrogen in a Neanderthal's bone collagen, we can reconstruct their diet. The results are stark and consistent. The isotopic signature of Neanderthals is almost always that of a top-level carnivore. Their nitrogen levels are incredibly high, similar to those of wolves and hyenas, indicating a diet heavily dominated by the meat of large herbivores like mammoths, bison, and horses. This technique single-handedly overturned the old idea of them as primarily scavengers, proving they were formidable hunters at the very top of the food chain. The teeth tell even more detailed stories. As a tooth grows, it forms microscopic layers like the rings of a tree. By analyzing the isotopes of elements like strontium in these layers, we can track a Neanderthal's movements across the landscape. Different geographic areas have different strontium signatures in their soil and water, which get passed up the food chain. A study of a Neanderthal from the Rhone Valley in France showed that this individual had moved over 100 kilometers back and forth between different ecological zones during their childhood and adolescence, a seasonal migration that likely followed the herds. Another story is told by the dental calculus, the fossilized plaque on their teeth. Trapped within this calculus are microscopic fragments of their world, starch granules from edible plants like water lilies and dates, chemical biomarkers for smoke from their fires, and even fibers from twisting plant material into string. Through this painstaking work, a simple stone tool is transformed. It is no longer just a shaped rock. It is a scraper used to prepare a reindeer hide for clothing, or a knife used to butcher a horse. The silent objects of the past are beginning to sing their songs, and through them, the daily intimate details of Neanderthal life are coming into focus. The clans divide: isolation, territory, and tribal migration patterns. The world of the Neanderthals was vast, and they were few. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the dominant human species, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Altai Mountains of Siberia, from the plains of northern Germany down to the shores of the Mediterranean. Yet, their total population at any given time may have been surprisingly small, perhaps only a few tens of thousands of individuals scattered across this immense territory. This created a unique social geography, a world of small, isolated clans separated by vast distances, a world where the tribal map was drawn by mountains, rivers, and the slow, patient march of the glaciers. The evidence for this divided world comes once again from the powerful lens of genetics. By comparing the genomes of Neanderthals from different times and places, we can begin to see the outlines of their population structure. A Neanderthal from Vindia Cave in Croatia, for instance, is more genetically similar to later Neanderthals from across Europe than to an older Neanderthal from Denisovo Cave in Siberia. This suggests that there were at least two major, deeply divergent populations, a European branch and an Eastern or Siberian branch. These groups may have been separated for tens of thousands of years, evolving in relative isolation. But the story is even more complex. Even within Europe, there seems to be distinct subpopulations that came and went. A major climate event around 130,000 years ago may have wiped out the Neanderthals of Western Europe, who were then replaced by a new wave of migrants from the east, creating a new, more homogeneous European population. On a more local scale, life was lived in small mobile family groups, or clans.
Their territories would have been enormous by modern standards, perhaps covering hundreds or even thousands of square kilometers. They were not sedentary. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic, following a seasonal round, moving between different camps to exploit resources as they became available. A group might spend the summer in the high country, hunting ibex and marmots, and then move down to a sheltered river valley for the winter, where game was more concentrated and firewood was plentiful. Certain prime locations, like a cave with a commanding view and a nearby spring, might have been used again and again, year after year, becoming a central hub in their territorial map. These vast territories and low population densities meant that encounters between different clans might have been rare, but they were essential. Without some contact, these small groups would have become dangerously inbred. Genetic evidence from a group of related individuals in Siberia's Shagirskaya cave shows that the group was very small and that the females were the ones who moved between groups, a vital mechanism for maintaining genetic health. These movements and the occasional meeting of clans at a resource-rich location would have been major social events. They would have been opportunities to exchange information, to find mates, and to reinforce a wider sense of a shared Neanderthal identity. The world of the Neanderthals was not a single, unified empire. It was a shifting mosaic of clans, a world defined by both profound isolation and the slender, vital threads of connection that held their scattered people together.
The forgotten coasts. What Neanderthals knew about the sea. The enduring image of the Neanderthal is of a hunter of the cold northern steppe, a creature of the inland, of caves and forests, forever tracking the great herds of mammoth and bison. But this picture is incomplete. As the glaciers advanced, they locked up vast quantities of the world's water, causing sea levels to drop by hundreds of feet. This exposed huge areas of the continental shelf, creating new coastlines and new ecosystems that have long since been drowned by the rising waters of our own age. And recent discoveries, from the submerged and surviving coastlines of Europe, are revealing a forgotten side of Neanderthal life. They were a people who knew the sea. At sites along the coasts of Italy and Portugal, archaeologists are finding evidence that Neanderthals were not just inland hunters, but also coastal foragers, showing a flexibility and adaptability that continues to challenge old assumptions. At the Vanguard Cave in Gibraltar, a place with a commanding view of the strait, we find the remains of their marine meals. They were hunting seals, likely clubbing the pups on the beaches. They were catching dolphins, perhaps by driving them into the shallows. And they were harvesting shellfish, leaving behind piles of mussel shells. This was not a rare or desperate act. The evidence suggests it was a regular, planned part of their diet, a reliable source of protein and essential fatty acids. To exploit these resources, they would have needed a deep understanding of the coastal environment, the rhythm of the tides, the seasonal habits of the seals, the places where the shellfish beds were richest. This coastal knowledge extended beyond just food. At a site called Cueva de los Aviones in southeastern Spain, dated to a remarkable 115,000 years ago, archaeologists found seashells, including cockle and scallop shells, that had been deliberately perforated and covered in pigments. These were not food waste. These were personal ornaments, beads for a necklace or decorations for clothing. They had selected specific, visually appealing shells, like the spiny oyster, and used them to create objects of symbolic value. This implies a connection to the sea that was not just practical, but also aesthetic and cultural. The sea was not just a larder, it was a source of beauty and inspiration. This evidence forces us to reimagine their world. We must picture Neanderthal families not just huddled in a smoky inland cave, but also walking along a windswept beach, the taste of salt on the air. We must imagine them timing their foraging trips with the tides, their children learning to pry mussels from the rocks. We must see them gazing out at the vast expanse of the water, an environment so different from the forest and steppe. and seeing not a barrier, but an opportunity. They were not just cavemen. They were people of the land and the sea. The discovery of their coastal lives is a powerful reminder of how much of their world is lost to us, submerged beneath the waves. And it is a testament to their intelligence and adaptability, their ability to master not just one environment, but the full, rich spectrum of the landscapes their forgotten world had to offer. The echoes of trauma. Injuries, illnesses, and how they healed one another. The bones of the Neanderthals tell a story of a hard and dangerous life. To examine a collection of their skeletons is to see a catalog of healed trauma. Fractures, crushed bones, and deep wounds were not the exception. They seem to have been a common part of the experience of being a Neanderthal. But these ancient injuries tell two stories at once. They speak of the immense risks of their daily lives, but in their healing, they also speak of something more profound, the existence of compassion, of social care, and of a community that would not abandon its wounded. The pattern of injuries found on Neanderthal skeletons is distinctive and revealing. They suffered an unusually high number of fractures to the head, neck, and upper body, while leg injuries are less common. For years, scientists were puzzled by this pattern, until it was compared to a modern group of people who suffer similar injuries, professional rodeo riders. The conclusion was that Neanderthals were getting these wounds in the same way, from close, violent encounters with large, powerful animals. This corroborates the evidence from their spears, suggesting they were not throwing them from a safe distance, but were thrusting them in high-risk, close-quarters combat with giant bison, wild horses, and other dangerous prey. Every hunt was a roll of the dice, a gamble with injury or death. But the most important word in this story is healed. The fact that so many of these traumatic injuries show signs of healing means that the injured individual did not die. They did not starve. They were not left behind. A person with a broken arm cannot hunt, cannot butcher meat, cannot gather firewood. A person with a severe head injury would be incapacitated for weeks, perhaps months. Their survival is a silent, powerful testament to the fact that someone else cared for them. Someone brought them food and water. Someone protected them from predators. Someone kept them warm by the fire. This is not the behavior of a brutish, every man for himself society. This is the signature of a group with strong social bonds and a sense of mutual obligation. The most extraordinary example of this is the famous Old Man of Shanidar from the cave in Iraq. This individual, who lived to the relatively old age of 40 or 50, was a walking catalog of ailments. A crushing blow to the side of his head in his youth had likely left him partially blind in one eye. He had a withered right arm, so badly damaged that the lower part had been amputated or had simply wasted away. He was riddled with arthritis and walked with a painful limp. In the brutal calculus of survival of the fittest, this individual should have perished decades earlier. Yet he lived on, a severely disabled member of his clan. He was a non-productive member of the group, a mouth to feed who could not contribute to the hunt. His very existence is proof of a deeply ingrained compassion. His clan valued him enough to support him for years. In the echoes of his trauma, we hear the clearest evidence of Neanderthal humanity. They lived hard lives, but they faced them together.
Narrative-ready story. The Edge of the Ice. How glacial shifts redrew their world. The story of the Neanderthals unfolded on the stage whose scenery was constantly, dramatically changing. That world was not a static backdrop, but a dynamic, shifting entity, governed by the slow, colossal breathing of the great ice sheets. For hundreds of thousands of years, the climate of the Pleistocene did not just fluctuate, it lurched violently between long, frigid glacial periods and shorter, warmer interglacials. These shifts were the engine of Neanderthal evolution and the force that continually redrew the map of their world. During the peak glacial periods, great ice sheets, thousands of feet thick, crept down from Scandinavia and the Alps. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered much of northern Europe, making vast areas of what is now Britain, Germany, and Poland utterly uninhabitable. The world's water was locked into this ice, causing sea levels to plummet and exposing huge tracts of land. The English Channel became a river valley, and Britain was a peninsula of mainland Europe. The North Sea was a vast, cold plain, a hunting ground for mammoths and the humans who pursued them. For the Neanderthals, this meant their world shrank. They were pushed south into refugia, pockets of survivable climate in places like Iberia, Italy, and the Balkans. These isolated populations would then diverge, creating the distinct genetic lineages we see in their DNA. Then the cycle would turn. As the Earth's orbit shifted slightly, the climate would warm with surprising speed. The great ice sheets would begin to melt and retreat. This was not a gentle process. It was a chaotic and dramatic transformation. Colossal meltwater lakes would form at the edge of the ice, sometimes bursting their banks in cataclysmic floods that reshaped entire landscapes in a matter of weeks. As the ice vanished, the land, freed from its immense weight, would slowly rebound upwards. The sea levels would rise, drowning the coastal plains and river valleys that had been prime Neanderthal territory for millennia. The world that had been open steppe would be reclaimed by forests of birch and pine, and later oak and hazel. For the Neanderthals, this was a world of constant adaptation. They were masters of the edge, living and hunting in the paraglacial zones near the great ice sheets. They were a people in motion, their migrations dictated by these epic climatic shifts. As the ice retreated, they would have been the first humans to move back into the newly opened lands of northern Europe, following the herds of reindeer and horse that colonized the new tundra. As the forests advanced, they would have had to change their hunting strategies, adapting from the open plains to the more closed, wooded environments. This cyclical process of contraction and expansion, of isolation and reconnection, was the defining rhythm of their existence. They were not just inhabitants of the Ice Age, they were its children. Their culture, their biology, and their very history sculpted by the relentless, creative, and destructive power of the ice. A slow disappearance, the long fade into extinction. There was no single cataclysmic event that ended the world of the Neanderthals. Their end was not a sudden apocalypse, but a long, slow fade, a gradual disappearance played out over thousands of years and across the breadth of a continent. After a reign of more than 300,000 years, a period of success and stability that dwarfs our own recorded history, they vanished from the archaeological record. The last faint traces of their existence, found in the caves of Gibraltar, date to around 30,000 to 28,000 years ago. Why they disappeared is one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution, a complex puzzle with no single easy answer. One of the primary suspects is climate. The period of their decline coincided with a time of extreme climatic instability. The Donsgaard-Oeschger events were rapid, violent swings in temperature, where the climate could shift from relatively mild to full glacial cold in the space of a few decades. These abrupt changes would have wreaked havoc on the ecosystems they depended on. The forests they knew would vanish, the herds they hunted would migrate or die off. While Neanderthals had survived climate change for millennia, this period of rapid, repeated shocks may have been too much, fragmenting their populations and pushing them to the brink. The other major factor, of course, was us. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe, around 45,000 years ago, meant that for the first time, Neanderthals had to share their world with another intelligent and resourceful human species. The competition was likely not for territory, in a violent, warlike sense, but for the same limited resources. Modern humans may have had a slight competitive edge. Their lighter, projectile weapons like the atlatl thrown spear might have made hunting safer and more efficient. Their use of needles to create tailored clothing could have offered better protection against the cold. They seem to have had larger social networks and longer-range trade connections, which would have provided a crucial buffer in times of scarcity. Even a small, persistent advantage, multiplied over hundreds of generations, could have been enough to tip the balance. The Neanderthals' own population structure may have been their undoing. They lived in small, isolated groups with low genetic diversity. This made them vulnerable. A single harsh winter, a new disease brought by the newcomers, or a failure in the hunt could wipe out an entire clan, leaving a void in the landscape that might never be refilled. As their numbers dwindled, their populations became more fragmented, making it harder to find mates and maintain a healthy gene pool. They were caught in a perfect storm: a rapidly changing climate, competition from a new and successful human group, and their own low population numbers. It was likely a combination of all these pressures that led to their demise. It was a slow retreat, a gradual shrinking of their world, until the last clans were clinging to the southernmost edges of Europe, before their fires finally went out and a profound silence fell over their lost world.
Narrative-ready story. Ghosts in the genome. How Neanderthal DNA lives on in us. The Neanderthals vanished from the world as a distinct people some 30,000 years ago, but they did not disappear entirely. They left behind ghosts, faint but indelible echoes of their existence, not in haunted caves, but in the very fabric of our being. The discovery that modern non-African humans carry Neanderthal DNA in their genomes was a revolution in our understanding of our past. It transformed the story from one of replacement to one of complex interaction and integration. These ancient genes are not just silent passengers, they are active participants in our biology, a living legacy of the time when our ancestors shared the world with another kind of human. This genetic inheritance, typically between 1% and 4% of our DNA, is a mosaic. Different people carry different pieces of the Neanderthal genome. If you were to gather all the distinct Neanderthal fragments scattered across the modern human population, you could piece together at least 20% and perhaps as much as 40% of their entire genetic code. This tells us that the interbreeding events were not just a one-off occurrence, but likely happened multiple times, in different places, whenever the two populations met. The children of these unions were absorbed into the expanding Homo sapiens population, and they carried their unique genetic heritage with them as they spread across the globe. What do these ghosts in our genome actually do? Scientists are only just beginning to unravel the complex functions of this ancient DNA. Much of it seems to be related to the immune system. Neanderthals had lived in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to the local pathogens. By interbreeding with them, our ancestors got a vital genetic shortcut, a ready-made suite of genes that helped them fight off the diseases of these new environments. This ancient gift may have been crucial to our own survival and success. However, this legacy has a double edge. Some of these same immune-related genes, so useful in the past, are now linked to autoimmune disorders and allergies in the modern world where our immune systems can overreact to a cleaner, less challenging environment. Other Neanderthal genes influence our skin and hair. They include variants that affect keratin, a protein that makes up our skin, hair, and nails. These may have helped our ancestors adapt to the different levels of ultraviolet radiation and the cold, dry air outside of Africa. Some genes are linked to our metabolism, affecting how our bodies process fats. Still others are associated with our brain, though their function is much harder to understand. Intriguingly, some Neanderthal DNA has been linked to a person's chronotype, whether they are a morning person or a night person, and even to mood disorders. The story is incredibly complex, but the message is clear. The encounter that happened in the mists of the Ice Age was not a fleeting moment. It was a biologically profound event
that continues to shape our health, our appearance, and even our behavior tens of thousands of years later. We are, all of us who walk the earth outside of Africa, the living repositories of their memory, the carriers of the ghosts in our genome. The myth of the brute, why the modern world got them so wrong. The word Neanderthal is still used today as an insult. It means brutish, stupid, thuggish, a primitive throwback. This image of a hunched, club-wielding, knuckle-dragging caveman is one of the most persistent and powerful myths in all of science. It is also almost entirely wrong. The story of how we came to so profoundly misunderstand our closest extinct relatives is a story about us, about our own biases, our own desire for a simple linear story of progress, and the slow, difficult process by which science corrects its own mistakes. The myth of the brute was born at the very moment of their discovery. When the first skeleton was found in the Neander Valley in 1856, the intellectual climate of Europe was not prepared for the idea of an alternate form of humanity. It was easier for influential scientists like Rudolf Virchow to dismiss the strange bones as those of a modern diseased individual than to confront the revolutionary implications. The first major scientific reconstruction by Marcellin Boule in the early 20th century cemented the myth. Based on the skeleton of an old arthritic individual from La Chapelle-Lausanne, Boule created a caricature. He portrayed Neanderthals as stoop-shouldered, with a shambling gait, a dull expression, and a divergent big toe like an ape's. He portrayed them as a failed dead-end branch of evolution, destined for extinction, a perfect foil for the triumphant, intelligent Cro-Magnon, who was our direct ancestor. This image fit perfectly with the prevailing view of evolution as a great chain of being, a linear ladder of progress with Victorian Englishmen perched proudly on top. The Neanderthal was cast as the brutish other, the savage ancestor we had thankfully surpassed. This image quickly escaped the confines of scientific journals and entered popular culture, where it has remained ever since, reinforced by countless movies, cartoons, and comic books. The club-wielding caveman became a stock character, a convenient symbol of primitive ignorance. But piece by piece, over the last 70 years, a mountain of evidence has accumulated to dismantle this myth. We now know their brains were as large as ours, or even larger. We know their tool technology, the Mousterian, was sophisticated, requiring foresight and abstract thought. We know they were not just scavengers, but apex predators who cooperatively hunted the largest and most dangerous animals of the Ice Age. We know they controlled fire, built shelters, and likely wore clothing. We have found evidence that they cared for the sick and elderly, a profound sign of compassion and social cohesion. We have found that they deliberately buried their dead. We have found that they created symbolic objects, ornaments, pigments, and even abstract engravings on cave walls. And finally, we have found their DNA inside of us, proving they were not so different that we could not produce healthy, fertile children together. To reject the myth of the brute is to accept a more complex and more interesting story of humanity. It is to see that the path of human evolution was not a single straight line, but a tangled, branching tree with many different successful ways of being human. The Neanderthals were not a failed experiment. They were a sister humanity, a people who mastered a continent for an immense span of time, a people of intelligence, resilience, and depth. The myth of the brute tells us nothing about them, but it tells us a great deal about our own capacity for prejudice and our long, slow journey toward understanding.
Europe before time. A final glimpse at the world they once ruled. Let us take one last journey back, not to a specific moment or a specific discovery, but to the world itself. Let us try to imagine Europe as it was, before us, a Europe without borders, without roads, without cities, a Europe that belonged, for a time that is almost too vast to comprehend, entirely to the Neanderthals.
Let us stand on a hill in what is now France, some 70,000 years ago, and simply watch their world unfold. The air is clean and cold, the sky is immense, a deeper blue than we are used to, unscarred by contrails. The silence is profound, a deep, resonant quiet that is not empty, but full of the small sounds of the living world, the whisper of wind through the pine trees, the distant call of a raven, the drone of a beetle. There are no engines, no sirens, no human clamor. The land rolls away in shades of green and brown, a mosaic of open grassland and dense, dark forest. In the distance, a river, unnamed and untamed, carves a silver path through the landscape. There are no bridges, no dams, no neat geometric fields. It is a world in its raw, wild state. From this vantage point, we see movement. A herd of wild horses, shaggy and dun-colored, grazes peacefully in a meadow. To the north, a small family of woolly mammoths, a mother and her young, moves with a slow, deliberate gravity through a stand of dwarf birch. This is their world, the world of the megafauna. But it is not only theirs. Near the river, sheltered by a limestone cliff, is a flicker of movement, a thin plume of pale gray smoke rising into the air. It is a Neanderthal camp, a home base. We can see a few figures, stocky and powerful, moving with a quiet purpose. One is scraping a hide, stretching it out on the ground, the rhythmic motion of the stone tool, a form of patient industry. Another is knapping a piece of flint, the sharp percussive cracks echoing faintly in the vast silence. A child, no more than 5 or 6 years old, chases a butterfly near the edge of the camp, their laughter a small, fleeting sound. This is the world they ruled, not through armies or edicts, but through intimate, hard-won knowledge. They knew the contours of this land as we know the streets of our neighborhood. They knew the seasons, the plants, the habits of every animal. Their world was smaller in one sense. Their entire social universe might consist of only a few dozen people. But in another sense, it was infinitely larger. Their territory was the land itself, their home a continent. There was a stability to this world, a rhythm that had persisted for 1,000 generations, the hunt, the fire, the family, the changing seasons. It was a life of immense hardship and danger, but also, we must imagine, of deep satisfaction, of belonging, of a profound connection to the living world that we, in our noisy, insulated existence, have almost entirely lost. This was Europe before time, a silent, epic kingdom of ice and life whose last echoes we can only now begin to hear. The Neanderthal within, what they teach us about being human. After the long journey through the ice and the millennia, after sifting through the bones and the stones and the faint, ghostly signals in our own DNA, what is the final lesson of the Neanderthals? What do these lost people, our closest extinct relatives, teach us about ourselves and about the very definition of what it means to be human? Their story, once a simple tale of a brutish, failed ancestor, has become a profound and necessary mirror, reflecting back at us a more complex, more humble, and more truthful image of our own place in the natural world. The first and most important lesson is that we were not alone. For the vast majority of our species' existence, we shared this planet with other kinds of intelligent, tool-using, large-brained hominins. The idea of a single linear progression from ape to human, with Homo sapiens as the foreordained pinnacle of creation, is a fiction. The reality was a world of immense human diversity, a branching tree of life with many different experiments in humanity. The Neanderthals were not a stepping stone to us. They were a parallel path, a different and, for a very long time, equally successful answer to the question of how to be human. Their existence forces us to be more humble, to recognize that our own triumph was not inevitable, and that other forms of human consciousness have existed and are now lost to time.
They also teach us to be wary of our own definitions. For so long, we defined humanity by a checklist of traits that we believed were unique to ourselves: language, art, symbolism, care for the dead. And for so long, we defined the Neanderthals by their apparent lack of these things. But as the evidence has grown, that wall of separation has crumbled. They communicated, they cared for their sick and injured, they buried their dead, they adorned themselves, they created symbols. They were not almost human, they were human. Their humanity may have been different from ours. Their minds may have worked in different ways, their cultures structured along different lines, but it was no less valid. They challenge us to adopt a broader, more inclusive definition of humanity, one that is not based on a narrow checklist of our own accomplishments, but on a shared capacity for resilience, for social connection, and for a deep engagement with the world that we, in our noisy, insulated existence, have almost entirely lost. This was Europe before time, a silent, epic kingdom of ice and life whose last echoes we can only now begin to hear.
The hidden valleys, where Neanderthals lived, loved, and vanished. The vast open sweep of the Mammoth Steppe was the Neanderthals' hunting ground, a place of immense opportunity and peril. But it was not where the heart of their world truly lay. To find the centers of Neanderthal life, we must look away from the wind-swept plains and into the sheltered places, the hidden valleys and protective cliffsides that offered a reprieve from the endless wind and the biting cold. These were not just temporary camps, but homes, places returned to again and again, generation after generation. They were the cradles of their culture, the stages for their family lives, and, in the end, the final refuges where their long story drew to a close. Consider the classic Neanderthal heartland, the Dordogne region of modern-day France. Here, rivers like the Vézère and the Dordogne have spent millennia carving their way through a soft limestone plateau, creating a landscape of dramatic cliffs, deep valleys, and abundant natural rock shelters. For a people of the Ice Age, this was prime real estate. The cliffs offered protection from the elements. The high ground provided a commanding view of the river valleys where herds of reindeer and horse would migrate, and the rivers themselves offered water and a supplemental source of food. It is no accident that this region is so dense with Neanderthal sites, places with names that echo through the history of archaeology. La Ferracie, a family cemetery; La Moustière, which gave its name to their entire tool culture; La Chapelle-Ussan, the resting place of the old man. This valley was, for a time, a kind of Neanderthal metropolis, a network of clans living in a landscape perfectly suited to their needs. Travel east, all the way to the Altai Mountains of Siberia, and you find a different kind of hidden valley, a more rugged and isolated frontier. In caves like Denisova and Shagirskaya, Neanderthals carved out a life at the very edge of their known world. The landscape here was harsher, the winters more severe. Genetic analysis from these sites gives us an intimate portrait of the families who lived here, revealing small, isolated groups where females would travel from their birth clan to join their mates, a vital thread of connection in a sparsely populated world. They hunted bison in the foothills, their lives dictated by a continental climate of extremes. This was the easternmost reach of their dominion, a testament to their incredible adaptability. Then turn south to the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraq, to Shanidar Cave. More than just a shelter, Shanidar was a home and a graveyard for generations. Overlooking a deep valley, it was a place of profound significance, a recurring point on a seasonal migration. Here, they brought their dead, laying them to rest in the floor of the cave that had sheltered them in life. It was a place of memory, its very dust imbued with the history of the clan. And finally, traveled to the last bastion, the ultimate hidden valley at the edge of the world, the southern tip of Iberia. In the caves of Gibraltar, like Gorham's Cave, the last known Neanderthals looked out over a coastal plain, with the shores of Africa visible on a clear day. They harvested mussels from the rocks, hunted seals on the beaches, and lived in the shadow of the great rock. As the cold intensified and the newcomers spread across Europe, this sunny, resource-rich peninsula became their final stronghold. The story of the Neanderthals is written across the continent, but its most intimate chapters are found in these hidden valleys, the places they called home. The sound of their world, wind, ice, fire, and the acoustic life of early Europe. Our modern world is a cacophony, a relentless flood of manufactured sound. We have forgotten what it means to truly listen. To understand the world of the Neanderthals, we must try to imagine its soundscape, to attune our ears to an acoustic environment that was at once profoundly silent and filled with a language of its own. The sounds of their world were the sounds of nature in its rawest form, a symphony of wind, ice, and life that was both a constant backdrop and a critical source of information, a stream of signals that meant the difference between safety and danger, hunger and a full belly. The dominant sound would have been the wind for much of the year, not the gentle breeze of a summer's day, but the immense soul-chilling howl of the katabatic winds pouring off the great ice sheets to the north. It was a sound of immense power and desolation, a constant reminder of the cold that ruled their world. And then there was the sound of the ice itself. In the periglacial zones where they often lived, the world would have been filled with the groan and crack of glaciers, a slow, deep grinding that spoke of the Earth's own immense power. In the spring, this would give way to the roar of meltwater as rivers, swollen and angry, carried ice and rock down from the mountains. This was the bass note of their world, the deep, elemental hum of a planet in flux. Against this backdrop played the sounds of the living. The animal calls of the Pleistocene were the sounds of opportunity and of mortal peril. Imagine the deep, resonant trumpeting of a woolly mammoth, a sound that could carry for miles across the steppe, signaling the location of a potential feast. The bellow of a herd of bison, the thunder of their hooves, the snort of a woolly rhino, these were the sounds of the hunt. But there were other more terrifying sounds that belonged to the mate. The guttural, saw-like roar of a cave lion, a sound designed to paralyze its prey with fear. The chilling, laughing whoop of a pack of cave hyenas, their powerful jaws capable of crushing the largest bones. And perhaps the most unnerving sound of all, the heavy, snuffling breath of a great cave bear disturbed in the darkness of a cavern they both sought for shelter. To survive, a Neanderthal had to be a master acoustician, their ears constantly scanning the environment, decoding every snap of a twig, every distant call. And in the center of this wild symphony were the sounds they made themselves. The most constant and comforting sound in any Neanderthal camp would have been the snap and crackle of the fire,
a sound of warmth, safety, and community. Around it, another sound would have defined their culture, the sharp rhythmic percussion of stone striking stone, the sound of a flint knapper at work creating the tools that made their lives possible. It was the sound of their ingenuity. And finally, there were their voices. We cannot know their language, but we can imagine their sounds. The quiet murmur of a mother comforting a child, the sharp call of a hunter signaling to his companions, the shared laughter around the fire, the solemn chants or whispers of a burial. In a world without writing, the voice was everything. The sound of their world was a complex tapestry, and to listen to it is to feel, for just a moment, the deep, resonant pulse of their lost existence.
Skin, fur, and ash. What they wore, what they burned, and how they adapted. To survive the relentless cold of Ice Age Europe was to wage a constant war against the elements. The Neanderthals' victory in this war, a victory that lasted for over 300,000 years, was not won by biology alone. It was won through a trinity of humble but life-giving technologies. The skin and fur they fashioned into clothing, and the ash-filled hearths that anchored their homes. These were not just accessories to their lives, they were the very fabric of their existence, the armor and the anchor that allowed them to master a world that should have been uninhabitable. The story of their clothing begins with the hunt. Every successful kill yielded not just meat for sustenance, but a hide, a raw material of immense potential. But a fresh hide is useless as clothing. It is heavy, stiff, and will quickly rot. Transforming it into a warm, pliable insulator was a laborious, time-consuming, and essential task. The evidence for this industry is found in every Neanderthal camp, the countless stone scrapers, their edges worn smooth from hours of work. Imagine a Neanderthal woman or man kneeling on the ground, scraping methodically at a reindeer hide, removing every last trace of fat and tissue. The hide would then need to be cured, perhaps by stretching it and rubbing it with animal brains and fats, or by smoking it over a fire. This was a sophisticated chemical process, a piece of practical knowledge passed down through generations. The final product was not the tailored, form-fitting clothing that modern humans would later create with their fine bone needles. Neanderthals likely used sharp stone awls to punch holes in the hides, lacing them together with strips of leather or animal sinew. The result would have been simple but effective. Heavy cloaks, leggings, and wrappings, likely worn in multiple layers to trap insulating pockets of air. They would have known which furs were best: the hollow hairs of a reindeer for warmth, the durable skin of a horse for footwear, the thick pelt of a bear for a sleeping blanket. To be a Neanderthal was to be draped in the skins of the animals you hunted, a walking testament to your mastery over the animal kingdom. The second pillar of their survival was fire, and its legacy is in the layers of ash that mark their hearths. A Neanderthal hearth was far more than just a source of warmth. It was a multi-purpose processing plant at the center of their home. It cooked their food, breaking down tough muscle fibers and killing dangerous pathogens, unlocking far more nutritional value from their kills. It was a source of light, extending the day and allowing for work and social life to continue after the sun had set. It kept the great predators of the night at a safe distance, its flickering light a protective barrier against the immense darkness. It was a tool, used to harden the tips of wooden spears, making them far more effective weapons. The creation of birch bark tar, an ancient adhesive used to attach stone points to those spears, required a complex oxygen-starved heating process, demonstrating a truly sophisticated control of pyrotechnology. The management of fire, Choosing the right fuel, keeping it lit through the long winter nights, perhaps even transporting embers from one camp to the next was one of their most critical skills. Skin, fur, and ash, these were the humble elements of their dominion, the quiet technologies that turned a hostile world of ice into a home.
The prehistoric mind, how Neanderthals thought, remembered, and dreamed. What was it like to be a Neanderthal? To peer out at the world through their eyes, to think with their mind? This is the deepest and most difficult question we can ask of them. Their consciousness is a lost country for which we have no map. Yet, by looking closely at the world they built and the traces they left behind, we can begin to sketch the contours of their inner landscape. The Neanderthal mind was not a primitive or simple machine. It was a complex, powerful, and profoundly different instrument, exquisitely tuned to the challenges and rhythms of the Ice Age. At its core, the Neanderthal mind was a practical mind, a master of what psychologists call executive function. Consider the creation of a single levelose tool. To begin with a rough cobble of flint and see within it the finished, perfect flake required abstract thought and powerful visualization. To then execute the precise sequence of strikes needed to prepare the core and release that flake required planning, fine motor control, and a deep intuitive understanding of physics. This was not instinct, it was intellect. The same practical intelligence is evident in their hunting. To orchestrate a cooperative hunt of a giant bison, a group of Neanderthals had to hold a shared plan in their working memory, communicate complex intentions, adapt to the animal's unpredictable behavior, and anticipate each other's actions. Their minds were capable of navigating and mapping vast territories, of remembering the seasonal locations of plants, water, and game over the course of years. It was a mind built for solving the complex, real-world problems of survival. But their world was not only practical, it was also social and emotional. The evidence that they cared for the severely sick and injured is perhaps the most powerful window we have into their capacity for empathy. To tend to the old man of Shanidar, who was disabled for years, required the ability to recognize another's suffering, to feel compassion, and to act on that feeling even at a cost to the group. This suggests a theory of mind, the understanding that others have inner lives, thoughts, and feelings of their own. This social intelligence is also hinted at in their burials. The deliberate placement of a body in the earth is an act freighted with emotion and meaning. It speaks of grief, of respect, and of a mind grappling with the profound mystery of death. It is the beginning of ritual, a behavior that steps outside the purely functional. And what of the more ethereal aspects of their minds? Memory for them would have been paramount. In a world without writing, the collective memory of the clan, the stories, the knowledge of how to make tools, find herbs, and read the sky, was a library carried in the minds of the living. It was a sacred trust passed down through demonstration and voice. And can we doubt that they dreamed? A brain so large, a life so filled with intense experiences, the terror of the hunt, the warmth of the fire, the loss of a child, must have processed these things in sleep. We can imagine their dreams, visions of stampeding horses, of looming lions, of familiar faces in the flickering firelight. We can never enter the Neanderthal mind, but the evidence they left behind allows us to stand at its edge and marvel at its depth, its power, and its entirely different, entirely valid form of humanity. The Last Campfire, a final reflection on the lost world of the Neanderthals. Come and sit for a moment at the edge of the world. The place is a cave on the coast of Gibraltar. The time is some 30,000 years ago. The sun is low over a gray sea. The wind carries the scent of salt and dry grass. A small fire, the only point of warm light in the gathering dusk, crackles and spits. Around it sits a family, a small clan, their faces illuminated in the flickering orange glow. They are stocky and powerful, their brows heavy and their eyes deep-set and intelligent.
They are among the very last of their kind. This is the final campfire, and its light is the fading twilight of a world. For 300,000 years, they were the masters of their continent, a span of time so immense that it renders our own recorded history to a mere footnote. They endured the crushing advance and slow retreat of the great ice sheets, adapting their bodies and their culture to a world of constant, dramatic change. They were the ultimate survivors, the pioneers of human resilience. They learned to hunt the giants of their age, to turn stone into an extension of their will, to harness the power of fire and make it the heart of their home. They were not brutes shambling through a hostile world. They were a people of profound competence, of deep knowledge, and of a quiet, enduring strength. In their long reign, they developed a humanity all their own. We see it in the careful burial of their dead, a sign that life had a meaning that transcended its end. We see it in the healed bones of the infirm and the elderly, a testament to a compassion that bound their small clans together. We hear it in the whispers of their emerging art, in a polished eagle talon, a pigmented cell shell, a mysterious red line drawn on a cave wall deep beneath the earth. They were not just surviving, they were living, feeling, and beginning to ask the questions that we, their successors, still ponder in the dark. Theirs was not a failed humanity, but a parallel humanity, a different way of being that flourished for an eon. Why did their fire go out? There is no simple answer, no single villain, no final decisive battle. It was a slow fading, a convergence of pressures, a climate that flickered with a new, violent instability, the arrival of a new kind of human, our own ancestors, who were perhaps more numerous with a different kind of technology and a wider social network. Their small, isolated populations, which had been a strength for so long, became a vulnerability. They were not conquered, they were slowly, imperceptibly absorbed and replaced. They retreated to the hidden valleys, the last refuges, until one by one the campfires winked out. But their story did not end with the last plume of smoke that rose into the Iberian sky. A part of them survived. It survived in the fragments of their DNA that are woven into our own, a ghostly inheritance that still shapes our health and our biology. And it survives in the lessons they teach us. They teach us humility, reminding us that we were not always alone, that our path was not the only one. They teach us to look for humanity in unexpected places, to broaden our definition of who we are. They are the ultimate memento mori, a reminder that even the most successful and long-lived reigns must eventually come to an end. The fire is out now. The shadows have claimed the cave. A great silence has fallen over the world they knew. But in the quiet of our own minds, if we listen closely, we can still hear the echo of their passing.
Blisters and steam. Laundry day in midwinter. The world outside Agnes's window was a study in white and gray, a landscape bled of all color. But inside her small scullery, the world was a roiling cloud of steam. It purled on the stone walls, dripped from the low ceiling, and fogged the single pane of glass until the frozen city beyond was nothing but a blur. For a few precious moments each laundry day, this steam was a shield, a temporary truce with the bitter cold that clawed at the door and seeped through the floorboards. The comfort was a lie, of course. It was a damp, fleeting warmth, born of toil and pain. At the center of the room, a massive copper cauldron sat over a roaring fire, its contents, water, lye, and the linens of the well-to-do Pembrokes, hissing and bubbling like malevolent stew. The air was thick with the acrid chemical smell of the lye soap, a scent that caught in the back of the throat and stung the eyes. Agnes's hands were her sacrifice. Plunging them into the scalding water with a heavy wooden paddle was the first trial of the day. The heat was ferocious, a shock that traveled up her arms. But it was the lye that did the real damage. It was a slow, insidious acid, eating away at her skin, leaving it red, raw, and prone to cracking. By the end of the day,
Her fingers would be a tapestry of tiny weeping fissures and angry blisters. It was the price of clean linen. It was the price of survival. She worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, her body a machine of labor. Haul the boiled sheets from the copper with the paddle, sloshing burning water onto the flagstones where it hissed and steamed. Heave the sodden heavy mass into the first rinsing tub of cleaner though still scalding water. Then, using a washboard of ribbed wood, she scrubbed, her knuckles scraping against the board, her shoulders and back screaming in protest. The steam billowed around her, clinging to her hair, her clothes, her skin. She was breathing water, living in a cloud. Her son, 6-year-old Thomas, sat huddled on a small stool by the fire, as close as he dared get to the spitting flames. He was a small, quiet boy, with a persistent cough that seemed to echo the dampness of their lives. This steamy room was the warmest place in their tenement, and laundry day was a strange blessing for him. He watched his mother, his eyes wide in the misty air, a small, silent witness to her Herculean efforts. "Is it done yet, Mama?" he asked, his voice small against the bubbling cauldron. "Almost, my love, almost through the boil." She gave him a smile that felt cracked and stiff on her face. Her own family's clothes, a pathetic, threadbare pile in the corner, would be washed last in the murky, exhausted water left over from the Pembrokes' fine Egyptian cotton and lace-trimmed nightgowns. There was a bitter poetry in that, washing the fabric of their dreams before tending to the rags of her own reality. The true battle with the cold began when the washing was done. The rinsing and wringing complete, she had to take the wet laundry outside to hang. The moment she opened the scullery door, the cold attacked. It was a physical presence, a predator that devoured the steam in a single gulp, replacing it with a crystalline, lung-searing chill. She carried the wicker basket, heavy with damp, clean cloth, out into the small, grubby yard shared by the tenement block. The wind was a bully, snatching at the sheets, trying to tear them from her grasp. Her hands, already tender and raw, were instantly assaulted. The dampness on her skin turned to a film of ice. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 tiny needles stabbing into her flesh. She worked frantically, her fingers growing stiff and clumsy. She fumbled with the clothespins, her numb digits barely able to work the springs. The transformation was immediate and surreal. The wet linens, pliable and soft in her hands just moments before, began to stiffen on the line. The water inside the fibers froze solid. A pillowcase caught by the wind froze in a perfect billowing curve. A man's long-sleeved shirt hung with its arms outstretched like a scarecrow and made of ice. The entire clothesline became a gallery of frozen sculptures, a ghostly white army standing guard in the desolate yard. They would hang there for a day or 2 or 3, not drying, but freeze-drying, the ice slowly sublimating into the frigid air. When she brought them in, they would be stiff as boards, and she would have to thaw them by the fire before they could be ironed. Back inside the scullery, the steam was already dissipating. The fire was burning lower, and the warmth was retreating. The room was returning to its natural state, cold and damp. Thomas coughed again, a dry, rattling sound that tore at her heart. She went to him and pulled him into a fierce hug, pressing his small, cold cheek against hers. For a moment, she could share the residual warmth of the steam that still clung to her clothes, a fleeting gift from her labor. She looked at her hands. They were bright red, swollen, and crisscrossed with bleeding cracks. The lye had done its work. The cold had finished the job. They were the hands of a laundress in midwinter, a testament to a war fought and refought every week. They were ugly, painful things, but as she held her son, she knew they were also the hands that kept him fed, that bought the coal for the fire, that fought back, however feebly, against the encroaching frost. The steam was gone, but in the small circle of her arms, she held the only warmth
that truly mattered.
The wind that scoured the corner of Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill had a cruel, personal touch. It wasn't a simple, honest cold. It was a pickpocket, a hooligan, a thing that sought out the smallest gap in a man's defenses. The space between a scarf and a collar, the worn seam of a boot, and most viciously, the exposed flesh of his hands. Finn's stall was a flimsy bastion against this assault. He sold roasted chestnuts, the smoky, sweet smell of fragile invitation in the frozen air. The brazier's coals glowed a defiant red, but their heat was a lie, extending no more than a foot in any direction. It was just enough to keep the chestnuts hot and his face from freezing solid, but it offered no quarter to his hands. His gloves were a tragedy. Once they had been sturdy leather, a gift from his father. Now the seams had burst at the knuckles, and the fingertips were worn through into gaping holes. They were less a pair of gloves and more a memorial to the idea of warmth. To wear them was almost worse than wearing nothing. The tattered leather funneled the wind directly onto his skin, and the damp from the snow collected in the woolen lining, creating a clammy, icy poultice. Most of the time, he worked with them off, his hands bare to the elements. Pain, he had learned, was a landscape. At first, it was a sharp, biting agony, a crystalline fire. Then, as the hours wore on, it subsided into a dull, throbbing ache deep in the bones. Finally, sensation would retreat altogether, leaving his fingers feeling like clumsy, foreign objects attached to his wrists. This was the most dangerous stage. He could burn himself on the brazier or slice his thumb on the scoring knife and not know it until he saw the blood welling up, a startling red against his pale, waxy skin. His trade was a litany of cold exchanges. A customer would approach, their breath rising like smoke. They would hand him coins. The metal was a shock, leaching what little warmth he possessed. He would fumble the coins into his cash box with stiff fingers, his movements slow and deliberate. Then he would scoop the hot chestnuts into a small paper cone. For a blissful, fleeting second, the heat of the nuts would seep through the paper into his palm, a jolt of pure sensation, before he passed them over. Hand to hand, cold metal for fleeting heat. It was the fundamental transaction of his life. From his corner, he was an unwilling sociologist of the city's hands. He saw the wealthy gentlemen and ladies, their fingers hidden deep within fur-lined muffs or encased in fine kid-leather gloves, their gestures elegant and insulated. He saw the clerks and the shop girls, their hands protected by sturdy wool, practical and drab. He saw the laborers, their hands, like his, often bare or shoved deep into pockets, their skin chapped and raw. And he saw the truly destitute, the children with their hands tucked into their armpits, their faces blue with a cold that seemed to seep from the very soul. Gloves were a map of the city's hierarchy, and he knew his place on it. A woman in a fine dark green coat stopped at his stall. A plume of expensive perfume briefly overpowered the scent of chestnuts. "A cone, please," she said, her voice clear and unaffected by the cold. She did not look at him, but at some point over his head. She opened a small purse and retrieved a coin with a gloved hand, placing it on the small wooden counter he'd set up. The transaction was sterile, distant. He scooped her chestnuts, took the coin, and she was gone, a ghost of warmth and privilege. A few minutes later, a young boy, no older than 7, sidled up to the stall. He wore a man's coat, the sleeves rolled up multiple times, and he had no hat and no gloves. His hands were red and raw, shoved into the pockets of his thin trousers. He stared at the glowing chestnuts with an intensity that was painful to watch. "How much, mister?" he asked, his voice a tiny shivering thing. "Threepence for a cone, lad," Finn said, his own voice rougher than he intended. The boy's face fell. He looked at his own chapped hands as if willing coins to appear. He had nothing. He just stood there, mesmerized by the heat and the smell, a small statue of want. Finn felt a familiar, unwelcome pang in his chest. Pity was a luxury, an emotion that cost more than chestnuts. But the sight of the boy's hands, a mirror of his own, but on a smaller, more fragile scale, broke through his practiced indifference. He looked around. The street was busy. No one was paying them any mind. "Here," Finn grunted, quickly scooping a small handful of nuts into a cone. He didn't take the largest ones, but he took more than a few. He pushed it into the boy's hands. "Go on, before they get cold." The boy's eyes widened. The heat of the paper cone in his bare hands must have been a revelation. He stammered a, "Thank you, mister," so quiet it was nearly lost to the wind. And then he scurried away, clutching his prize as if it were crown jewels. Finn watched him go, a strange ache in his throat. He hadn't saved the boy. He hadn't changed his life. He'd just given him a moment of warmth, a brief respite from the gnawing cold. For that one moment, their shared gloveless state had been a bridge, not a barrier. The day dragged on. The sky grew darker, the wind more insistent. As he finally began to pack up his stall, his hands protested every movement. Counting the day's meager earnings was an exercise in agony, the cold coins sticking to his skin. He shoved the money into his pocket and looked up at the great, silent clock tower that loomed over the city. Its face was a pale, indistinct moon, its hands frozen, or perhaps just moving too slowly to perceive. Time, like feeling, was a casualty of this endless winter. He wrapped his cracked leather gloves around his bare, aching hands. They offered no warmth, only a flimsy psychological shield. The pain would return, sharp and demanding, as soon as he stepped away from the dying embers of his brazier. It was the price of the trade, the cold currency he dealt in every day, paid from his own flesh and bone. The great clock tower of St. Giles was the city's heart, and its steady, resonant chime was its heartbeat. For generations it had governed the rhythm of urban life. Its voice called children to school, workers to the factories, and the faithful to prayer. It marked the midday meal, the lighting of the lamps, and the locking of the gates. The city did not simply exist in time, it was orchestrated by it, a complex mechanical ballet set to the clock's unwavering tempo. But this winter, the heart was failing. The cold, a relentless siege engine, had scaled the tower's stone walls and waged war on its intricate soul. Frost, delicate and deadly as spun glass, coated the enormous black clock face, obscuring the Roman numerals in a glittering shroud. It crept into the clockworks themselves, a fine crystalline dust that thickened the lubricating oil into a stubborn grease. The great pendulum, once a symbol of immutable physics, swung slower, its arc shortened by the cold's immense, invisible friction. The gears, miracles of brass and iron, turned with a groaning reluctance, their teeth grinding against a resistance they were never designed to face. Time began to drift. At first, it was subtle.
The morning bell, meant to ring at 6, might sound at 10 past or quarter past. The factory whistles, synchronized to the tower, blew late, sending a ripple of confusion through the dark, cold streets as workers hurried to their shifts, unsure if they were early or late. A lamplighter named Arthur, who had set his route by the 5 o'clock chime for 30 years, now found himself looking to the sky, judging the quality of the fading gray light like a country farmer. He felt unmoored, his life's precision erased. Routines, the scaffolding of city life, began to buckle. A baker, Mrs. Gable's cook, accustomed to pulling her loaves out of the oven at the first stroke of 7, now relied on smell and instinct, and her bread was often not as perfect. Appointments were missed. A young woman waited for her suitor under the tower's shadow, stamping her feet against the cold, until the creeping dusk told her that the agreed-upon hour of 3 had passed into oblivion, leaving her to wonder if he had forgotten or if time itself had betrayed them. Then one Tuesday, the clock stopped chiming altogether. The massive bells, their bronze chilled to the core, hung mute. The hammers, encrusted with ice, failed to strike. The silence was more profound, more unnerving than any late or muffled ring had been. Noon came and went without its customary booming announcement. In the market square below, people paused in their transactions, heads tilted upwards, 1,000 faces turning to the clock tower as one. They stared at the frozen face, the hands pointing to a time that was no longer true, 11:45, a moment preserved in ice. A collective, unspoken anxiety rippled through the crowd. The city's heartbeat had stopped. Without the clock, the city began to shed its modern skin, regressing to an older, more primal state. The tyranny of the minute was broken. Life was now measured in broader, more elemental strokes. The day was divided not into hours, but into 3 stark periods: the dim gray light of morning, the brief, brighter gray of midday, and the swift, deep dark of evening. Meals were governed by the gnawing of hunger, not the position of a clock's hands. Sleep was dictated by exhaustion and the cost of coal, not by a prescribed bedtime. In the factories, foremen blew their whistles by feel, their authority suddenly arbitrary, leading to grumbles and disputes on the factory floor. The orderly flow of commerce and labor became a sluggish, uncertain thing. The city, once a marvel of precision and industry, now moved by instinct. Silas the ice seller no longer measured his day by deliveries per hour, but by the ache in his back and the growing length of the shadows. Ilara, scrubbing the steps of the gable house, knew the morning was over not by a chime, but by the shift in the wind and the deepening blue of the sky. Finn, the chestnut vendor, packed up his stall when the last of the homeward-bound workers had passed, a human tide that ebbed without a clock to command it. The silence of the tower changed the very sound of the city. The air, once punctuated by the regular tolling of the hours, was now a continuous soundscape of carriage wheels, vendors' cries, and the ever-present whisper of the wind. Time was no longer an external, commanding voice from on high. It was an internal, personal feeling. It was the rhythm of a mother's rocking chair, the slow drip of a leaky roof, the beat of a shivering heart. Some found it liberating. They felt freed from the relentless pace that the clock had demanded. But for most, it was a deep and unsettling loss. The shared reality that the clock had provided was gone, replaced by a million individual, subjective timelines. The city had lost its coherence. It was no longer a single, unified body moving in concert, but a collection of isolated souls, each navigating the frozen landscape by their own dim light. From its silent perch, the clock tower presided over this new, timeless city. It was a monument to a forgotten order, its gears locked, its voice stolen by the frost. It had tried to impose a human mechanical order on the world, but the world, in the form of a relentless, indifferent winter, had simply shrugged it off. The city would survive. Its people would eat and sleep, work and weep, live and die. But they would do so in a different age, a temporary dark age ruled not by minutes and hours, but by the rising and setting of a pale winter sun and the profound, enduring silence of the frost.